Welcome, Alexander and Layman. It's great to be with you again. I hereby call to order the next meeting of the Shamanic Tantric Hegelian Cosmopolitans. After our last conversation, Alexander, you mentioned that you had read something by Layman on different forms of nihilism, and that you might like to get together with us again to talk about that, maybe to look at what Layman was talking about and how that intersects with your own work, and see if we could weave that in also into the tantric and shamanic themes that we've been exploring together. So I want to turn this over first to Layman to kind of talk about what was in his article and his view on nihilism in general, and then we can open it up to further discussion. I won't be present in much of the conversation, but I will join in as I'm able. Most of this will be in your hands. Okay, Layman?
Maybe I'll just do a quick overview. Nihilism or nihilism for me is the cumulative trend toward self-nullification in persons and in our inner plurality and also in our cultures. So it's to cancel reality or to undermine somethings by making them into nothings, or to favor methods of empowerment that actually lead to disempowerment. And I think it's occasionally associated with cognitive propositions about the value of life and the meaning of the universe. And it's occasionally associated with people being conscious enough to say, I believe in nothing, but those are really special cases, and also cases in terms of the transformation of nihilism into something that might go beyond it. So for me, most nihilism is latent. Its primary forms are idealism and a kind of pseudo-pragmatism. It's rare to recognize it, and it's even more rare, but essential to pass through it into a new relationship to value. And I think this is similar to the notion of naive, cynical, and affirmative that I've seen in some of the Syntheist material. I think we can tell a pretty coherent story about the biological and social history of nihilism, right from the dawn of history through the official monotheisms to the forms it takes in quasi-secular societies. I'm interested in how it shows up cognitively, emotionally, physiologically, culturally, and also in the tragedies that can unfold if we don't diagnose it and do something about it. And I would say that Nietzsche did exemplary work in beginning to investigate in the modern West this whole issue, and that his efforts can be extended with reference to healthy esoteric religious traditions and to the ideal of a full spectrum Tantra-like empowerment and flourishing, and with the kind of meta perspectives that we associate today with the varieties of developmental integrative pluralism. So I would be happy to talk about any of those facets, because I think this is super important and philosophically stimulating, and because I like you guys.
Yeah, I could just add to that that what also brought me to this topic with you guys, so I want to dig into it with you, and I say nihilism here, I'm European, is that our dear friend Thomas Hammerich, the Danish AI and increasingly philosophy guy, mentioned in a conversation I had with him and Andrew Sweeney that he thinks of Nietzsche as the first properly tantric thinker of the West. And I think you guys probably agree with me here that the first guy we have in the West really makes a distinction between sutra and tantra in the way that's always done in the East would be Nietzsche. And that's also why he's also interested in nihilism, is that it's simply that when you go from the sutric, which is what we basically teach each other on how society works. For example, when you raise kids, you teach them how life works so they can hopefully one day become adults and be able to handle life. And that's called sutric knowledge. But on top of the sutra, there's the possibility of seeing through everything in life, seeing through the myths and the illusions we live with, and see some kind of reality beneath it all. And with that comes the realization that values are something we human beings create and have to create. And that is, I would say, the tantric starting position. And in Nietzsche's case, what he does is that he basically shows that the division between sutra and tantra existed already within Christianity, but according to Nietzsche, Christianity pretended there was no such division, and therefore became 100% officially a sutric religion, basically disposing with tantra, which then Nietzsche tries to sort of bring back with what he calls the Dionysian. So he takes paganism and he takes a Dionysian and shows that the Dionysian has a life to it and has an awe to it that is lacking in Christianity. And this, obviously, to anybody who's familiar with Eastern thinking, would be very, very similar to putting Tantra and Sutra in opposition to one another, but also realizing that life has to include both. Now, having said that, I would just like to add to nihilism that the reason why nihilism is so interesting is it's a kind of a zero level in philosophy. But it also means, for example, that you can't write and claim that you're a nihilist, because then you're contradicting yourself. You just put effort into writing. That means you put value into writing. That means you're no longer a nihilist. So you can't even discuss nihilism, because if you put effort into having a dialogue with somebody, like we do right now, and we're obviously enjoying this, otherwise we wouldn't be here, then you can't be a nihilist either. And as a matter of fact, you can lie down and be a slacker, and if your body still breathes, you realize that the breathing itself has a value to the body. And if you just want to go and kill yourself and commit suicide, that's another effort that you put a value to. So you cannot be a nihilist. It's impossible to be a nihilist, but it's still interesting as a philosophical idea, because it is the zero level where there are no values at all, if you can imagine that. So we could start building or looking at different values after we've been in that position.
I think it's very interesting to look at it in terms of the notion of enfolded layers of complexity and structure. Because in that sense, a zero layer, which if there was only one layer, a zero layer would make no sense. But if it's actually attempting to regress or roll back to a more primitive layer that's less functional and has less value, then the fact that it makes no sense is sort of a clue that it's going against its own structures, right? It can't act without value, but it can act toward its values in ways that make it less valuable, in ways that detach it from value structure. So I think that the actual nihilism very seldom can say it's nihilist, and the people who say they're nihilist are almost definitely not nihilists. But the nihilistic pattern is to undermine the level of value we could get by being consistent at the level we're at and growing past it. And it allows us to use our values in a way that undermines their operation and makes them less valuable.
Yeah, it's a bit like being an atheist. The reason why it's hard being an atheist is that you get so many gods to kill all the time, because you obviously have to kill them all by principle, because you claim you're an atheist. And after you kill them all, because they're supposedly higher than you in some kind of a hierarchy, then you probably have to go and kill yourself as well, because you're the last god you need to kill if you're an atheist. So it's an impossible position to take in a way, but it's very, very interesting and rewarding to work with. Yeah, and in the kind of work that we do, Jan Söderqvist and I, obviously our interest in nihilism is that Nietzsche, again, being the first properly tantric thinker in the West, is incredibly productive, because Nietzsche has so many unfinished projects. And obviously Gilles Deleuze and many of the major thinkers of the 20th century, Jacques Lacan, many of them started from Nietzsche in their work. And that's what we try to do too. And nihilism is a perfect example of that. Nietzsche discusses nihilism basically from the point of a Protestant Christian thing that was actually an integral part of Protestant Christianity from the very beginning, and one day would kill it. But there are so many nihilisms in the sense that each historical paradigm that we go through with its specific ideas, its specific power structures based on specific technological communicated relations between human beings in that given society will one day be folded, because history moves on, especially through new technologies and new ways of communicating and new ways of storing and processing information. And these changes over the past 10,000 years have moved us from one paradigm to another paradigm. And when we leave a paradigm, we have to go nihilistic about the paradigm we're leaving. It would suddenly have no value at all to us, because suddenly we are completely immersed in a new paradigm. And that change, that switch from one paradigm to the next, and the nihilistic process we need to go through to go there is incredibly painful and very often bloody and violent in history.
Yeah, the two things come up for me there. One is this necessary work of teasing apart more nihilistic or less nihilistic ways of approaching any phenomenon, right? If we say, like, if you go to a Buddhist and talk to them about emptiness, are they talking about it? Are they experiencing in a way that leans a little bit towards pretending they're thinking a thought that isn't really a thought? Are they sabotaging the mind? Or are they entering into an actual epiphany-like upgrade of the status of their being? right? And the same phrasing could go in either direction. It could be regressive or progressive. So a lot of things that sound nihilistic to many people are actually extremely positive, extremely vital movements. On the other hand, a lot of things that sound very safe or even very aspirational to a lot of people might actually be regressive. So it's important for me to tease those apart. Underneath every concept, you can make this distinction. I think Nietzsche was working on that, of finding the healthy and the unhealthy version of every concept. But I also think, like you're saying, there's a relative nihilism in the sense that when it becomes possible for us to access a new, higher, deeper, richer intensity of value, then the existing structures we have are relatively less valuable, and we need to sort of let them die.
Yeah, I can give you an example, the abolition of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
It hasn't become universal yet as an idea, but it almost is. And it can still be questioned if we just institutionalize slavery a different way, whatever. But the whole idea that slavery actually is a menace on mankind requires a nihilism concerning slavery. And I would prefer to call this paradigmatic nihilism. So in this sense, nihilism is a stage during a paradigm where a certain idea takes root, and possibly it's not so much that it's good and evil. I'm obviously opposed to that. It's rather that a certain idea no longer carries much value for humanity, and we could actually afford to get rid of that idea altogether. I would then propose, for example, today that now when the algorithms are here and they guide us and they guide our informed decisions every day, then maybe we could look forward to the abolition of advertising. Mm-hmm. Now, that means that we have to push nihilism forcefully through every damn advertising agency in the world and get rid of the whole idea that people should constantly try to sell shit to other people that haven't even asked for it, right? Now, for that to happen, that requires a long nihilistic procedure that has these sort of the naive state followed by the cynical state, followed by possibly an ironic state, and then followed by an affirmative state before we finally through with it. And we arrive at something we can, for example, call work or, authentic communication or something that can actually then, as new paradigm, replace the old idea that's become redundant.
Yeah, I think in my phrasing, I usually think of nihilism as the negative version of a process of death or cancellation, which has a huge value in the system, right? Like I would think in terms of a carefully coupled balance between eros and thanatos, right? That we're always, in order to regenerate and adapt and evolve, we always have to be doing that Darwinian thing of producing and also selecting, culling things. So we have to be making ourselves and canceling ourselves. And that's balanced in any given moment, but it's also the balances shift when you move between phases and paradigms. So there's a really useful place for death in life, right? If things didn't die, the process couldn't move forward. So we have to accept all of that in a very affirmative way and use it intelligently, but those variables can become uncoupled, right? If you have growth without selection, then you get cancerous phenomenon, right? But if you have an imbalance toward the canceling part, and it's not coupled to the growth part, then you just start canceling things. And so they're so finely balanced that it's very easy to go out of balance a little or a lot. And we end up finding degenerative forms of growth, but we also find these patterns of people colluding together to cancel the things that make human life worthwhile.
Absolutely. And this is Nietzsche's point. His nihilism is one of creative destruction. He didn't use that term because it didn't exist in the 19th century, but he could have invented it. And the pointer is that Nietzsche is both enthusiastic about what he calls the aristocratic ideal, the possibility of being at the beginning of a new paradigm, the one who steps forward and creates new values, or who finds out the proper values for that paradigm, we would probably say today. It's like a riddle to be solved, right? But Nietzsche is also deeply, deeply concerned in what he sees as the death of God in Western culture. We would probably today call the death of a paradigm rather than the death of God. But what Nietzsche calls the death of God in this case, he's deeply concerned because he also understands that there's a destruction going on here, and Christianity itself has kickstarted it. And with modernity and with enlightenment, now Christianity is quickly killing itself, and we haven't left people with any alternative. This is why Nietzsche should always be read together with Dostoevsky, Dostoevsky is like the Russian author who is often called the Russian Nietzsche. Dostoevsky then writes novels where he shows how the collision between, say, life in the Russian countryside with the highly educated urban elites who come to the countryside, some kind of missionaries of modernity, and just ruin life for everybody because they don't know what they're doing. And this is what Nietzsche warns us about. And to a large extent, of course, Nietzsche was a prophet, especially when it comes to the two world wars, and especially regarding the Second World War, when Hitler claimed to see Nietzsche as an inspiration. When you read Nietzsche and read Hitler's own text next to each other, there's not, and Nietzsche would have hated Hitler more than anybody, right? He would have been absolutely disgusted with the sort of banal vulgarities that Hitler presented. But Nietzsche also said, this is the kind of shit that fills the vacuum when God dies in the culture. And what we inherited, John and I, in our work, is that we constantly warn people in our work. We're not moralistic. We constantly warn people and say that even if we sort of embrace the new paradigm, we embrace a netocratic elite coming out of the digital age that will take over the world and have certain values, and they will live in certain ways, and they will eventually dictate the conditions of everybody else. And we also have a massive problem with the new underclass that we call the consumptaria. But when we do this in our work, we also say, if we move too quickly into the new paradigm, then we get these huge collisions where the values of the old paradigm and the technologies of the new paradigm collide. And that's exactly what we're seeing online today with these huge sort of Facebook lynch mobs and things like that. It's the collision of an old paradigm with a new one, and people are basically not informed. I mean, they don't know what they're doing. It's like Christ said on the cross, Nietzsche constantly repeats, it says, people don't know what they're doing, and that's exactly why this is so scary.
I think it's really interesting that you and the people you're referencing talk about Nietzsche in connection with Sutra and Tantra, because I think in my mind, there's two things that make Nietzsche very tantric. One is that he always wants to look below the text, right? He's in a way that he psychologizes philosophy. You don't know what someone means. They don't necessarily represent themselves in their propositional claims. Something else is going on. So you have to get beyond just the presentation of the sutra, which sounds very good, sounds like it tells you the way to the truth, but it doesn't necessarily do that, because it's organically embedded in all this complexity that's underneath it and hidden from you when you read the surface of the sutra. And you have to become a tantric explorer in order to find out the authenticity that the sutra might be hiding. And then at the same time, I think Nietzsche, because he wants very much to find a single thread through all of the functions of nature and mind, he wants to unearth the empowerment impulse or the energetic flow experience that underlies both positive seeming and negative seeming values. What do good and evil have in common? What do we have in common with the animals and the plants? Is there an energetic value thread that can run through all the scales of reality, the way Shakti flows through all the forms of the universe in the East? And so he does that. He's trying to articulate something that applies to all of the centers and all of the beings. And when you do that, you necessarily become tantric in your outlook. You necessarily reach for a spirituality that is embodied and ecological and full spectrum. And so I think it's really good to go back to him as a source point for that. And he doesn't complete these things, but he's running around or dancing around madly, opening all the doors that are the pathways through which we need to explore now.
Yeah, and we wouldn't have deconstruction, a la Heidegger or a la Derrida, without Nietzsche. That all starts with Nietzsche, right? They're all Nietzscheans in that sense. But I would add here also that at least I would love to have Bruce's take on this. I think Bruce would understand this very well too. It's like Nietzsche understands history, and especially history of writing, as messages in bottles. So he sees himself very much as the guy who's very lonely, has very few people to talk to. He considers Spinoza a dear friend, for example, although Spinoza's been dead for 200 years. But at least by reading Spinoza, he has a friend. And he has Wagner, of course, as a known friend. There was even a long triangular relationship between Wagner and his wife Cosima and Nietzsche for many, many years. So Nietzsche wasn't into celebrities. That's completely misunderstanding him. He was one of these guys who was looking, can I have somebody to talk to, somebody to think with, or somebody to go to the theater with? And he was dying to have friends. But he also saw that a lot of thinkers and writers throughout history probably had experienced the same thing. And they would then have written down their messages, but put them somewhere like maybe somebody someday will be able to read this and then turn me into a friend, although I'm dead and I've been gone for a long time. So he sees his own writing like messages that he puts into bottles, and he puts these bottles into the ocean and then hopes they're going to drift off somewhere and somebody will one day pick them up, who will then not just throw away the bottle and eat the paper, or would actually read it and get something out of it. But he also sees a risk in this. And this is where he really becomes tantric, in that if the tantric spirit it's let loose in the wrong environment, in the sense it's let loose too early in an immature environment, it can cause enormous havoc. So he's very concerned with that. And that's why when you throw the bottle in the ocean, like you do if you're a writer like Nietzsche, and hope that somebody sometime in the future, or at least somewhere else, will pick up the bottle, read your message, and find it very, very creative and say, yeah, I could work with this. This is fantastic. I've got a friend here. What he says is that human beings do not understand that the ideas we put out there in the world will affect the world itself. And because we haven't really calculated what would be the results of us putting these spirits out there, we throw these spirits out there. And suddenly they start causing enormous amounts of havoc. So for all the good intentions we had, they could all end up really, really wrong. And this is precisely what's tantric, in the sense that when you go into the tantric mode, the first thing you learn is what we call the barred absolute. Here's a wall between you and the outside world. There are very few people who understand what you're up to next. And there are very few people who should hear what you're up to next, because a lot of people should know, and a lot of people who would know would misunderstand it so ferociously that they would go out in the world and cause enormous havoc because of it. And in this sense, Nietzsche warned us about Hitler. You know, he warned us that a guy like Hitler would come along, read Nietzsche in all the wrong ways, although Nietzsche had made all the precautions he possibly could have made in his books, that some kind of German racist could never come along and find Nietzsche as a friend. But Hitler just completely ignored that and decided to kidnap Nietzsche, reinterpret him the way he wanted it, and then turn Nazi Germany into the worst form of vulgar parody of Nietzscheanism you could ever imagine. And with enormous consequences on Nietzsche's own thinking and his work as well. It took us another 50 years after the Second World War to finally have the first proper Nietzschean Renaissance. That was not until the 1960s. So even Nietzsche himself was caused a lot of damage because of it, which is exactly Nietzsche's tantric aspect. Bruce, how about you? Tantra and Sutra and Nietzsche, where do you come into the picture here?
You know, Tantra has a tradition of terma teachings that are written and hidden someplace because there's a recognition that possibly this time is not the right time for what I have to say. And you put it out there and you hide it. And in a way, you trust karma, serendipity, whatever, to bring the teaching into the right hands. But there's always a risk that it could fall in the wrong hands and be destructive. In the tradition I've been studying in for a lot of years, you know, aspects of the teachings were never in writing. It was an oral tradition, and aspects of it were only whispered one person to another person in certain contexts because of the explosiveness of the ideas if they were taken in the wrong way and used. So I definitely feel that tantric spirit in Nietzsche, and also you could say some of the enigmatic way that he writes and the kind of the double meanings and the illusions, that there's a coding in a way of what he wants to say without directly explicitly saying it, which again you find in a lot of tantric texts or some Gnostic texts where they'll code what they want to say so that it really takes a certain level of insight to penetrate that and really pull out what all of the reference are. In relation to you know, where we find ourselves now, and a lot of our circles are talking about a meaning crisis, and Nietzsche really seemed to pick up on the signs of what now has really fully unfolded as you know, what many people perceive now as meaning crisis. I wanted to ask you guys your takes on something like you know, the notion of false consciousness, or Sloterdijk's notion of enlightened false consciousness. And where basically we know, in a sense, that the structure that we're carrying forward as a paradigm in our thought, in our action, doesn't really have foundation anymore. We can't trust it, but we do it anyway. And we have our own self-critique built into our paradigm now, so that we remain relatively immune from, from deconstruction, because we've already folded the critique in, but we proceed without actually conviction in what we're doing. We carry on. Zizek talks about that a lot in terms of the function of ideology. So Sloterdijk gives kind of an interesting genealogy of Enlightenment critique that leads to our moment, which maybe we can talk about. But first, I just want to check in with you about this idea of enlightened false consciousness, and what Sloterdijk's movement between, or wanting to transition from kind of the prevailing cynicism of our age to what he calls cynicism, rooted in Diogenes and Nietzsche.
Yeah, this rhymes in with the 4 different levels of nihilism. So if you read my books with Jan Söderqvist, you'll discover that we discuss 3 different, there's first naive, and then cynical, and then affirmative nihilism. But Peter Towson, one of the savants I work with in my team, he just sat a couple of years ago and said, well, there's something lacking here. Shouldn't there be an ironic stage as well? And he was very much into Nietzsche at the time, I should say that as well. Then I said, yeah, but why didn't we see that? Because we were obviously taking the whole idea from Nietzsche and said, instead of just talking about nihilism, why don't we talk about the different stages of nihilism that nihilism goes through? And then we built that from Nietzsche. And then I just discovered that, the reason we didn't see the ironic coming was the ironic must happen in parallel with affirmative. And this brought us to the other Nietzschean idea that we had to split, and that was Nietzsche's concept of the will to power. Now, the will to power in Nietzsche is his affirmative nihilism. It's not that there's a pathic force there within you, a libidinal force. It says, yeah, the old world is over and I'm in charge of creating the new world. There's aristocratic ideal of Nietzsche. But that will to power is always split. And this is, of course, an idea that goes back to Zoroaster, the genuine, actual, authentic Zoroaster historically, who splits the will to power already 3,700 years ago into Ahura and Masta and put them opposite each other. We would call them being and mind today. And being and mind are 2 very different things. But our sense of being, our embodiment, is both being and mind. We're both body and soul at the same time to begin with. So we're both in existence of some kind, and there's also an activity going on. And this division inspired me and Jan Söderqvist to then split the will to power between the will to intelligence and in will to transcendence. Historically speaking, you would ascribe the will to intelligence to the priest in the community, and you would then ascribe the will to transcendence to the chief or the king. So you would separate the royal from the priestly. And the will to intelligence, basically everything that's ever happened in history until now. It's the love of knowledge. It's when we wake up in the morning, turn on the computer, jump into a book, read, check out the world news. We just want to get the world in. We want to get history. We want to get more out of history. We want to know more about other worlds and other places and things like that. Read novels, everything. This urge to consume these things is the will to intelligence. But then there's the will to transcendence, which we will go into creative mode, which is like, how could I possibly create something that never ever existed before? What would that mean? And these are 2 different wills. And we actually specialize as human beings. We admire those who go into the other realm. So we either specialize into the will to intelligence, or we specialize into the will to transcendence. Today, we'd call it the academic and the entrepreneur, something like that. We specialize, we go to these modes. And that it was lacking in Nietzsche. And that's exactly why we didn't see the ironic and the affirmative. So I wouldn't be able to understand Sloterdijk here unless I'd made that split first. What Sloterdijk is trying to do is to push us now out of cynical nihilism into ironic nihilism, when we can start doing something with the nihilism itself, where we're aware of it, when it doesn't have to be explained any longer, when we can play with history and do something creative with history itself, which can then become the affirmation of the new and then lead to a new paradigm establishing itself. I think the last part is lacking in Sloterdijk, but I think Sloterdijk is concentrating very, very hard on the shift from cynical to ironic. Maybe that's also where the whole concept of the shift from postmodernism to metamodernism comes into the picture, because I've seen metamodernism as an idea that once embraced a kind of irony that postmodernism failed with. And postmodernism therefore became the cynical nihilism, whereas we are now ready for the ironic nihilism. But please observe, my theory at least is that the affirmative nihilism has to start simultaneously with ironic nihilism. A priest on his own, who only accumulates intelligence, that has no ambition whatsoever to affirm anything new, is a tyrant. Just like the guy who wants to affirm the new and ignores history. A Pol Pot, for example, of Cambodia, is another tyrant. We never ever want to fall into the trap of only having will to transcendence, or never fall into the trap of only will to intelligence. And that is a will to power fails. And this is kind of what Nietzsche probably would have written had he lived longer, but never had the chance to write. Obviously, because he never wrote the Wille zur Macht book that he was planning. And this is probably what he would have worked on in that case.
Yeah, I think there's a deep need for the ironic and the affirmative to be together, because balance, and I think Nietzsche is already starting to think this balance is the key to doing any of this in a healthy way. And he is very concerned about the possibility that it could be done wrongly. Right. I think although he remains friendly and positive about Wagner, he does do these critiques of Wagner's effects on people and Wagner's music toward the end of his life. And he says this kind of the sense that you can just build power up into these overwhelming expressions is very dangerous, especially if it's encapsulated in nationalism and idealism. And those people aren't going to look like nihilists or think they're nihilists. They're going to think they're believers who've discovered the very levers of truth, but they're going to lead to disasters, because it's not about unleashing the Dionysian. It's about integrating the Dionysian. It's about the dharmification of what cannot be spoken. I think the other side of that is that there is irony built into affirmation, right? I think this in the sort of adjacency sense, which is irony describes the correct functional relationship to the world in all of its dimensions that is tantrically or shamanically enacted. They might not have conceptualized it like that, but they were able to find a way of relating to each quality and dimension of energy in the world that was more functional, more successful, generated more flow, and generated more implicit value experience. And when we describe irony, some people view irony as a removal, like you're not touching the power as closely as you should. But actually, it's that slight offset. It's that adjacency that puts you in the workable relationship with any kind of energetic flow. So I think you don't have affirmation unless you have some kind of positive energy flow, which you don't really have unless you're taking some kind of ironic stance, whether you know it or not.
I agree. And it's kind of, if you use sexual metaphors here, it's kind of, the priest has to go in a more voyeuristic mode. We would call it perverse mode. That's at least what Slavoj Žižek would say. I mean, that's perfectly fine. Perversion means that you can enjoy things at a distance, and therefore you can also control them. And then, of course, the chief is the character who then goes into the exhibitionist mode in the sexual. So this is the sort of the fantasy of the sexual ritual, pagan sexual ritual, speaking of the Dionysian. Those two roles are then switched in the social arena, as often is the case. So in the social arena, the priest walks up and gives a speech. And he celebrates, we got the young king here, and the king's going to go into battle today. And here we got the hunters, and they're going to go out and hunt today. And then it's the priest who goes into the exhibitionist mode by giving that speech. And then, of course, the king goes off and executes on the priestly order, right? So these shifts are there. And this is why irony and affirmation, definitely there's a dance between irony and affirmation here. And that is the beginning of the new paradigm, or the beginning of the new religion, whether you want to call it one or the other. A new God is born, if we use Nietzschean speak here. So that is interesting here. And we're probably getting to that point eventually, depending on, of course, technological change, and depending on if we don't make too many mistakes and things like that. We live in a very critical era of the next 50 to 100 years. So we know it's called the atomic bomb, and it's called climate change, right? So we know that for a fact that this paradigm shift that we're going through right now has global consequences to an extent that we never saw before. And that's probably why there's an urgency to the meaning crisis on a level that we've never seen before either. I just want, I want to bring up, go, you go, because another thing I want to bring up is the Dionysian here. And that's also another thing that's lacking in Nietzsche, and where he's not tantric enough. And that his Dionysian is too simple. It's just purely Dionysian. And he uses basically as the Greek theater celebrated as the opposition of the Hebrew religion of Christianity, right? But in reality, it's the Russians always point out that he mistakes the Dionysian and the Cybelian for one another. And here again, we go between the ironic and the cynical. So the cynical nihilism is expressed by the Cybelian mob. The Cybelian mob, this is, of course, this is the goddess Cybele from the Greeks, right? And Cybele falls in love with her own son. So the son has to be castrated. So they cannot realize the potential love between mother and son here. Therefore, Cybele becomes this bitter old hag of a goddess who's surrounded by these sort of very, very sort of, wishy-washy, bitterly gender-neutral creatures of some kind, eunuchs or something like that. It's an army of eunuchs following a bitter goddess, essentially. And the Cybelian mob is, of course, what we're terrified of. My critique of woke culture today, for example, has been that woke has gone very Cybelian. It's not Dionysian. It's not celebrating the power of the new. Black Lives Matter don't celebrate the new Africa rising. It's just immersing itself in the tragedy of slavery again and again and again, and then want to put tax money on it to solve it, which they never want to solve anyway. The Cybelian attitude is that, this is bad, and we enjoy the badness of it, the horrors of it so much that we want to stay in it and immerse ourselves in that mode. That's a Cybelian mob. And against that, we should, in the spirit of Nietzsche, complete his work by proposing a Dionysian swarm. And the Dionysian swarm is the affirmative tribe that walks forward using irony and affirmation to establish the new. And this is where art comes into the picture. This, of course, where sex comes into the picture. Maybe there's even creative violence involved in this, or at least, creative destruction certainly is involved in it. But all those forces in there that are, it's almost Shivistic or something like that. All those forces in there, I would prefer to call the swarm a Dionysian swarm and put it opposed to the Cybelian mob, because I think Camille Paglia and many other Nietzscheans have sort of tried to approach Nietzsche's celebration of Dionysian and problematize it. And I think it needs a split in the middle. Just like we split the will to power, we need to split Nietzsche's Dionysian force here to not be naive about it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people miss the way that Nietzsche's feelings about the Dionysian changed over the course of his work, right? And he didn't make that explicit. So now we have to make those conceptually explicit. But the way he originally conceived of the Dionysian versus the Apollonian, that's as far as most people get in understanding what he was working on. But when he writes at the end of his life about that book, he says, this is my least mature volume. It's the most confused. I'm now talking about the philosopher Dionysus, about the integrated Dionysian, about to me, it's the spirit of the style in which he begins to write, because after, he's looking for something, he's looking for a force of cultural renewal in the early books. After he writes Zarathustra, he feels like he's succeeded. Now he has something, he has an answer, and the answer is expressed in the new tempo, the new style of his writings. He doesn't always make that conceptually explicit. We know he's thinking through it because we have the journals, but in the published works, he doesn't even want to really make it explicit. He wants to show the rhythm as much as he wants to make the propositional statements. But now it's also a time for us to make clear the shift in his thinking that he was embodying in the final volumes compared to the early volumes.
That is what we call pathical narrative. Yeah. So poetic. One of the few philosophers who also managed to become a poet was Nietzsche. Yeah, I agree. And also this division we had before he returns in Dionysian versus Apollonian. The Apollonian in Nietzsche is the priestly role, actually. That's the will to intelligence, whereas the will to transcendence is what he puts into Dionysian. So he can put art in the Dionysian realm, and then could they put knowledge into the Apollonian realm.
I think there's a way of thinking about the interplay between the tantrically transfigured, integrated Dionysian and the regressive nihilistic in any moment, in any aspect of life. But there's also a way of telling a big narrative about it, which is something that Nietzsche plays with, right? He's tells this story of tribes enslaving each other. Right. And I think we could take that as suggesting more than just sociocultural violence between groups. It's also any kind of trauma, or right. It's the stress that's put upon you by new technological inventions. It's the stress that comes from a sudden drought. It's also the stress that comes from being enslaved by a group that's more powerful than you, or even traumatized by people within your own tribe. But you end up in this position where, in order to affirm yourself, you have to affirm against your oppressor. And that's useful because it helps you get your power back, but it's also dangerous because now you're interpreting some positive attributes as negative, right? We say that their ability to defeat me was bad, and therefore strength is bad. So maybe I should demonize strength. So now if I win, if I successfully accomplish the slave revolt in one way or another in my life, in my society, now I'm in charge. But I have this way of thinking where some positive values are now negative and some negative values are now positive. And we all inherit this weird mixture. And it comes, and there are periods in time where people figure out a lived psychotechnology whereby they can heal that, right? And the infusion of the Eastern wisdom into the pre-Socratic Greek culture created this explosive moment where they were able to figure out some practices that overcame that. But then it starts to degenerate. And we get people just merely thinking of the world as an encyclopedia of propositional knowledge, where they can't quite tell healthy values apart from unhealthy values. And that feeds into Christianity, and it feeds into the Roman Republic, and it feeds into a society in which the highest values that are proposed to us are explained to us as if they don't exist, right? The best thing about life is what happens to you when you're dead. The meaning of the universe is something that happened before or outside the universe. God is invisible and you can't even think about it. It's made unreal. The highest value is made unreal at every step. And just because we undermine the dogmatic assertions of Christianity doesn't mean we got over that. So now we're in a post-monotheistic period where we still inhabit this world where most of the things we think occupy value are actually empty. So we need to be able to dig into that, to experience and explore the nihilism and use the tools of irony to help us do that. But we've got to figure out a way to get past it to a place where we can, you were talking about the difference between intelligence and transcendence. We have to make more of the transcendental capacity more intelligent, right? It's always been the case that we have used our empowerment drives to create values for ourselves and each other. But now we need to know how that's done. We need to be able to technologize it to a certain degree, as some of the great sages have done. Because if you encounter the Tantric guru and he's just overflowing with an infinity of value at all times, he's laid hands on the mechanism of evaluation. He's pulled off the superhuman move that Nietzsche said might heal us from the degradations of the normal way we value things through our narratives. But we need to collectively be able to talk about that. We need to be able to intelligentize the transcendental practices and moves so that those can be much better partners going forward, because we have a lot of complexity to face.
Yeah, and here is my problem, both with Christianity and with Nietzsche, and it's the individualism that is inherent here. Now, if Nietzsche is exploring the mind of the king or the mind of the priest, I'm perfectly happy that he's talking about an individual, but that's not what he does. He talks about this as if this is the only project that's going on. And this is where I'm critical, in that the axial age, starting about 800 before Christ, through the invention of a new alphabet by the Phoenicians and the Hebrews, it creates what Marshall McLuhan would regard as a myth of the individual. And it's not that individualism starts with René Descartes, although he's credited with being the father of modern individualism. But I would say it really starts with the little pillar saints and the little boy pharaohs that are created by the axial age, when written language suddenly exists. And written language creates this illusion that we know more than we do. Now, Nietzsche is critical of that, of course, because he knows there's more to the text than what we think. But it becomes your own project. And then if you're having dialogues with other people who are into their own projects, and then finally you end up with contemporary society with thousands of individuals having dialogues with one another, where they're all on their own self-help paths towards some kind of valuation. That's just an empty loop to me and deeply inhumane. And that is why I propose this term tribal poiesis, because tribal poiesis demands of you that a new value has no value at all unless it materializes hyperjectively out of one of these creative swarms. So imagine you've got a Dionysian swarm here. It's not a swarm full of resentment. That would be a Cybelian mob. This is like a cult of heroism, and it's performed tribally. So it's a kind of a collective, right? And out of that collective process comes ideas that the entire tribe can adhere to and benefit from. And I think this is much more human. The tribal poetic is much more human. And this is why when we try to sort of throw Marxism or any of these ideas that we could collectively achieve something in life, that includes Christianity too in its congregation, by the way. It also includes Islam and its ummah. You know, all the major religions and many political ideologies always talked about the congregation as the fundament for humanity. And I'd say that the lonely hermit, if he sits there and he goes really high on his tantric revelation of whatever infinite is, he hasn't done the job properly, because the job of the tantric is to really find truth in the deepest possible sense, and then determine whether the rest of society is ready for it or not. And if they're not, then determine who's ready for it, and then invite those into the tantric process, so that, again, a value can come out of the sacred room in the temple. Something can be created in the sacred space in the temple that everybody benefits from, even if the ingredients in the sacred space must be kept secret, because they're genius in bottles that must not be let outside of the bottle of the sacred room itself.
The dimension of the ironic and also the dimension of the adjacent is inherently relational. And I think that the tantric approaches and to some degree the shamanic approaches have always embodied that. And Nietzsche is rediscovering that, but he's sabotaged by his personal emotional and social difficulties, his own life as a hermit, and inability to really connect with people for a variety of reasons. But I think he is groping towards that. And I think yes, the left brain axial dominance puts us in a weird position and makes us think about single objectified things and single objectified individual selves, and breaks us apart from the relational complexity webs in which we're embedded, and also sabotages our ability to heal that, because we can't integrate the right brain, left brain. We can't bring the Dionysian into Apollonian form in the world very well. There are some interesting takes on Nietzsche. I really enjoy the book Nietzsche and Religion by Julian Jung, in which he makes a strong communitarian argument for what Nietzsche is saying, and that the great man is the necessary thing that the community needs in order to reestablish its experience of value. But I do think Nietzsche has some personal detriments that make it difficult for him to feel into that area. And I also think he is crying out in the last few volumes. He's trying to initiate a tribal poiesis, right? He said, these books are not for everyone. They are for a group of new philosophers, for attempters and experimenters who I don't see them, but when I look beyond the horizon, I know they're coming. And this book is for them. It's not for everyone to read. It doesn't contain what you think it contains. It's an appeal to my tribe, and I can feel them. I'm initiating the poiesis or participating in that poiesis. They're just not here yet, and I'm going to have to live that. It's going to suck, but I know they're coming, and I want to help them become the people who can initiate the ultra-human age in a healthy fashion.
I agree. And this is where it's interesting, because I'm not a big fan of Heidegger, but if you're a big fan of Nietzsche and individualism, that's probably the place to go. And you can't do more navel gazing than Heidegger. That's impossible, right? But I'm a great fan of the French Nietzscheans, who's in that heritage starts with Gilles Deleuze. It's ironic that the same year that Heidegger put out his 4 books on Nietzsche, the old wise Heidegger, 1960s. So the beautiful books. But at the same time, Gilles Deleuze comes along as a young genius in France and publishes Nietzsche and Philosophy, another absolute must-read, by the way. It's even the best place to start with Nietzsche is to read Deleuze first and then read Nietzsche himself.
I agree.
So Nietzsche and Philosophy is a magnificent book where Deleuze basically lays out his program, presents his entire programs in 2 books that come soon afterwards called Difference and Repetition and The Logic of Sense. And then basically Deleuze's project is over. All the other books he wrote later, like 1,000 Plateaus and all those that pretentious students love to show around with all the time, are basically just commentary. So Deleuze does that. Foucault does the same thing. Foucault is another really fascinating Nietzschean. And what Foucault does, in the fundamental sense, is that he constructs a reverse Nietzscheanism. He says that, yeah, this master-slave relationship in Nietzsche and in Hegel before him is fascinating and true. But what if we just reverse the roles? What if we move into a mode of a slave who really enjoys being a slave and is not really resentful about it? You know, what would that be? And that is obviously Foucault himself, personally. Foucault then inspires another Bruce's favorite, Giorgio Agamben. There wouldn't be an Agamben without Foucault before him. And I think Agamben is another one. A book like Homo Sacer to me is a beautiful book of reversed Nietzscheanism. It's Nietzsche, but the reverse perspective also taken. What if we just talk about, say, the people at the very bottom of society and talk about society? Skip the individual, skip the aristocratic ideals, just skip those things. Just go into the Nietzschean mode, the master-slave relationship, and then discuss master-slave as the opposite. So we can, improve on Marxist class analysis, whatever you want to call it, or rather throw it out if we can invent something better. But I think that's what both Foucault and Agamben try to do. These are my Nietzscheans. These are the Nietzscheans that inspired me to be the kind of social philosopher that I am today. And where I then go back to Nietzsche and the more personal project in Nietzsche is, I think it ties in what Bruce discussed before as the contemporary meaning crisis. Now, if we allow ourselves to be a bit American, European middle class here, and it's not that we're ignorant about the fact that COVID-19 is causing havoc in Africa at the moment and climate change is, obvious or whatever, but it's not that. It's not that the huge problems aren't huge, but if we allow ourselves the meaning crisis on our own personal level, on a sort of existentialist level where we're at, which Heidegger certainly would, or Derrida would do as well, then I would say that today, where we're at in the current paradigm shift, when we're massively moving into the digital age, is that we realize that there are 4 different realms, a quadrant, a bit like Wilbur here, but think of a quadrant here that has private and public, and then it has sacred and profane attached to it. And I would say today that why we discuss a meaning crisis for all of us is that the 2 columns of private and sacred under enormous pressure right now. Whereas state and market forces, the state and the market out there, the 2 gods that really are the masters of contemporary society, the state and the market, that try to convince us that there's no other alternative except the 2 of them. So even in China, the same thing, America, the same thing, Europe, the same thing. It's just state, market, which is, it's not priest and king here at all. It's rather a vulgarization of warfare versus hunting, right? So the war versus the hunt war has become state, and hunt has become market. And state and market, stupid, huge institutions or whatever, forces out there that we must submit to. They're the mouse is right. And these 2 forces are very much interested in expanding the realms of the public and the profane as much as possible. And therefore, they're putting privacy and they're putting sacredness under enormous pressure. And once we become aware of this is where we have to start fight back, right? Because otherwise we'll be completely overwhelmed, which what I would call the nihilism of absolute profanity profanity and I lost my words here. I'm human, you see. So the private and the second, profanity and publicity, the public. Publicity is the wrong word, but being transparent, the cult of transparency right now. And this is, of course, what Tantra Sutra comes back in. Tantra says that there must be a private realm and there must be a sacred realm. And the private and the sacred are much, much harder to understand, to maintain, to nurture, and to expand even, certainly the profane of the public. And I think that is why it's become obvious to millions of people that we're in a meaning crisis, because it's like, will somebody please say my privacy, and will somebody please allow me to have some kind of a sacred room where I'm not willing to sell things, where there are things like love that I will never sell, right? And that I think is the beginning of the wake up towards a shift from cynical to ironic nihilism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I just wanted to say that I always am very interested in the Foucault-Deleuze relationship and in Foucault's claim that the next century will be Deleuzian, because I think, he has some great attributes and also some failures, but I think he senses that what Deleuze is doing is the way forward for the Nietzschean pathway. And the quadrants thing is very interesting. You know, whatever system we use, whether it's, you know, like Wilbur provides a very interesting architecture, but whatever system we're providing, all of the areas in that system are areas in which we can look at this tension between nihilism and some kind of anti-nihilistic tantric production of our access to excessive value, let's say, right? To love, to transcendence, to the practices that produce our experience of something that overwhelms all of our other values and is greater than the entire encyclopedia of cognitive information we have, right? I think that's the authentic spiritual and religious lineage of human beings, but it's always been anchored in practices. We didn't always know it was anchored in practices because we described those practices in terms of assertions about the universe. But now we're in a situation, the postmodern situation, or whatever we want to call it, where we go, yeah, we've unpacked those assertions. It was never contained in the narrative. It wasn't contained in the propositional belief. They were useful sometimes and not at other times, but it was really contained in the praxis. There was something we were doing that allowed us to overcome our self-sabotage and personally and interpersonally generate an experience that was so pervasive and so coherent and so much more than our cognitive map of the world that we could take a stand on that, and it gave well-being and meaning to reality. And I think the meaning crisis is, it's not the absence of a belief story that we all have to buy into. It's the insufficiency of the production of these practices throughout society, regardless of what we call that.
Yeah, I think there are a couple strands here that come together in the responses to nihilism that I've seen emerging, say, with Caputo or with David Michael Levin, with Zimmerman and Wilbur, different responses which all seem to embrace, positively frame nihilism in a way. There's a positive embrace of nihilism, and there's a move towards the embodied and the practical. And, you know, in the case of Caputo, you know, he says basically he wants to frame a nihilism of grace, and that basically instead of allowing nihilism to be paralyzing, where there's just a feeling of being nothing, he calls for an nihilism as grace, where we see that life is given for nothing. There's no reason that life has been given, and we can therefore just celebrate life in its sheer givenness, and that any movement towards resurrection for him, it's very Haglund-like, where he would see we don't really want eternal life. We don't want the eternal and infinite, which is unthinkable and which actually devalues everything that we really care about when you put all value in the infinite in that way. So yeah, Caputo is saying, you know, instead of being nothing, we're being for nothing. And there's a waiting for the event. There's a waiting for something that brings more life. Right now, you could say that in our time, we kind of have a catastrophilia. We're longing for some kind of disaster that's going to punctuate our general malaise and force us to do and be and practice as if we cared again beyond the demi-reality that we inhabit, the different ideological kinds of circles. In Levin, he's actually, maybe I'll do, you know, Zimmerman first. I think this is a little bit too cute, but looking at Wilbur, he says there's a move from nothing matters to nothing matters. And there's a valuation of the nothing in the sense of the clearing in consciousness, the causal consciousness that allows for the affirmation of everything in the openness of you know, causal consciousness. So he's doing the Wilberian, you know, Advaita and you know, semi-Buddhist move there. In, you know, Sloterdijk, he's looking to anthropotechnics. You know, with Diogenes, I think his example of taking Diogenes as an exemplar is not that strong in, you know, Critique of Cynical Reason, but he's looking at a person who is an embodied person who responds through practice and through his body to the whole haze and layers of critique that don't have any practices in them, and that if you only respond with more critique, you just basically end up in the same loop. And so there's the embodied inhabiting of the heyoka role, the embodied inhabiting of the jokester or the trickster who takes the ironic stance and metamodernly also lives them with earnestness, lives their gestures with earnestness. And I'm looking also at David Michael Levin, and one of the things he's drawing from Heidegger, I guess, is, but others as well, Merleau-Ponty and others, the need to recognize how our vision of reality has been, captured and hijacked, where we really only place value on the objective, and don't allow room for what he would say a circumspective care or a circumspective vision, the prepositional multidimensional seeing and being, that he says something like a practice of Gelassenheit is what makes possible the puncturing of the meaning crisis and the puncturing of the nihilism that's gripped us. There's a nihilism of Gelassenheit in that it's a letting go and a letting be, and it's a circumspect care that basically it's a polyphilia. It's something that embraces everything by, in a sense, a posture of pausing and letting go and letting be, which is the root of tantric practice. That's the Shine practice. Shine practice is the foundation that you learn to enter into those zones of concentration that are only accessible not through positive laser focus, but through a profound 360-degree letting go and letting be with the object, so that you can listen to it multidimensionally. That kind of practice is needed, he's saying, in order to basically lay the foundations for a more fully embodied tantric embrace. And interestingly, just as an aside, Levin, after talking about that, ended up going off on I think a 30-day dark retreat to do the full Dzogchen tantric and yoga in the sacred space that's been set apart, that basically brackets out everything entirely for a period of 30 days for you to do a very, very deep embodied reconfiguring of your whole energy systems and your whole perceptual systems.
I find it interesting, but this concerns the timeless aspect of the sort of techniques that are taught over generations. And when we discuss nihilism, I think it's important that I want to pull it back into the social again, in the sense that it's not only that new technologies arrive and they change everything. So obviously the internet has changed everything. It's a kind of technology that actually affects every other technology already exists. So cars are no longer even cars, right? They're part of the internet too. So with electric engines and everything. So the internet just swallows everything in its way. And it's obviously a new world technologically. And we are basically the same humans, but live in a totally different reality to what we did 50 years ago. Now, the potential of that is fantastic. And it's like any artist. Artists love to have new materials to play with, because there's a certain exhaustion that arrives when you played with a certain material enough times, and you're still expected to maintain a certain heritage, right? But if you think of a paradigm as an historical period, suddenly there were new technologies available, and human beings could do really creative and artistic things with this. And of course, they caused a lot of havoc in the process, and you had rebellions, and old institutions fell apart, and new institutions had to build gradually, and all of this could be quite violent. But after all, a new paradigm established itself, a new world with new values established itself in a Nietzschean sense. So that is what a paradigm is. Now, as the paradigm proceeds, it also exhausts itself. What that paradigm arrived with, the new materials, for example, the printing press, there were only so many ways you could do books, right? Eventually we got television or radio, but it was just more vulgar and more commercialized versions of the books, wasn't it? So the problem is that you're supposed to, this is Wilton telling you, you're supposed to pick up a heritage from previous generations. You're supposed to keep that heritage going, which is why we build museums. You're supposed to, on top of that heritage, create something new, which is world to transcendence. And you can then go from one generation to the next, and the older generation can die in peace. Hopefully, the new generation can take over the world. It's all very tribal poetically, the whole thing. But the problem is this: if you exhausted a paradigm, we exhausted modernity, we exhausted modernism, it also went wrong. We also saw its problems. We also saw its benefits, right? We knew all of that all of a sudden. We then started deconstructing it. And the problem with postmodernism wasn't that there was anything wrong with the deconstruction itself. The problem was that postmodernism started looking like the end of the game. Then it switched from a Dionysian force into Cybelian mob. And that's when we all reacted against postmodernism and said, no, this cannot be the end of history. No, 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 no. No way, because you're basically putting a nihilism onto an entire paradigm without even imagining a new world, which is like the worst thing you could possibly ever do. So I think the freedom in the affirmative nihilism that Nietzsche is looking at, and we're looking at too in the tantric mode, the freedom of the artist, the freedom of the philosopher, the freedom of the prophet, the freedom of the trickster or the joker or whatever, but the freedom to be be one of those archetypes and express that to the benefit of, if not mankind, then at least your own tribe. To be able to do those things is that suddenly in history you discover you're at an event. And to me, Slavoj Žižek, Alan Badiou, they're all sitting there passively waiting for the event, like they're waiting for somebody to come in and take over the world, and then they're going to celebrate the guy when he comes along, right? Very messianic, right? They're all messianic. They're all very Christian. But I'm saying that no, the event happens first, technologically speaking, without us even understanding that it occurred. Then we realize, oh, since the early 1980s, the internet arrived. It changed everything forever. And now AI is coming along. Which is just the next step of the same phenomenon. Wow, that's a whole new game. Well, if we are excited about the new game, even if you understand the many problems it will bring with us, but if you're excited about the new game, we become affirmative nihilists. We realize that I don't have to recreate my father's world. I can actually cleanse the plate. I can put my father's world in a museum. I say, it's there, accomplished, boom, big sign of approval on it, but done. Book closed, right? Start fresh. Not start fresh in that there was an evil world that we needed to get rid of. No, it's an accomplished world. It's complete. The materials were exhausted. We did everything we could do with that kind of paint and with that kind of paper. And now we have new materials and new colors and new technologies.
Even though this is a story of radical change, in some ways, it's also what nature constantly presents us with, right? The leaves on the tree start fresh every year. They've completely dispensed with the previous resources. That constant refreshing is a capacity we have when we approach our situation with A, the right attitude, but B, an insight into the practices that are needed to sustain that attitude and to colonize and take over and skew the new situation in a positive sense. So
it's half the package, Layman. That's my point. That's why I loved your conversation here with Bruce about these practices and the techniques and things. But that is what I call process. And I'm adamant that process and event are always together. Event cannot happen without process. Yeah. If you try to think event without process, then you fall into the very problems of Western culture again and again. Eventology Absolutely. Requires process, but that the season comes back and that the leaves are green again and all that. That's just like having children. That's a rebirth. That's just next generation. That happens, and that's why half of the practices we do have to be in this timeless mode, which I call process oriented. But the other possibility we're talking about here is the possibility of the event, and the event in this sense is that when we've experienced before in history, that radical things can happen that change the game completely, allowing us to play a new game. Then that's a new paradigm. And that is what Nietzsche discusses when he talks about the death of God. He realizes that Christianity was part of a paradigm. I would call it the axial age paradigm. And it was one of his peaks during that paradigm and the one that he grew up with. But he also saw that built into that very religion from the very beginning was its own demise and its end. It would literally itself die on a cross one day. And he saw that, and he didn't see where things were going. And he both fantasized Dionysianly about what could happen, and he was also deeply concerned about the Cybelian mobs that this could create. That's essentially what Nietzsche, in an apocalyptic way, prophetically wrote about the 20th century and was dead right. So, and we're still more than ever living in that mode now. But what I'm trying to get is that if we can make a difference here between these are timeless practices, this is how you keep your body fit. This is nutrition. This is meditation techniques. This is what you can do. Oh, you're that kind of archetype. You know what? That archetype is deeply tantric. You have the capacity to become a deeply tantric person. You can navel gaze as much as you like, because you probably should. So you could be a role model for other people when you do that. Go ahead, do it. Here are the timeless practices that spiritual people have for thousands of years tried to find, so they can teach the next generation, who can teach the next generation in a timeless manner that it's never changed and possibly even added to. But on top of that, starting with the Persians, and then what we then established as the West, comes the dream of the event, which is really what the West is compared to the East. And whereas the East developed Tantra Sutra separately, we developed process and event separately. And the possibility for the event here, for me, I'm not sitting like Slava Žižek and Alan Badiou waiting, jerking off like a little teenager, waiting for some porn star to walk in through the door and declare himself the Messiah. That's essentially what Slava and Alan Badiou were doing, right? No, I didn't do being an event. That's Alan Badiou's book. I'm writing process and event. Radically different book, much more Eastern. And what I'm declaring there is that the event has already happened. I'm very high to get it. It's already happened. It's already new technology. It's already here. And we now realize that it's going to eat the world for breakfast. And we're going to be eaten by it too, submitted to it in an Aristotelian way. But what are we going to do with that? And that's exactly when we realize that dealing with and enjoying breaking down the old is the ironic element, and just creating the brand new out of nothing, out of the new technology and the new potentials is the affirmative.
I think it's very interesting to shift from being an event to process and event. Right. And in the Badiou sense, there's the encyclopedia of the world, which actually contains a version of transcendence that it's already integrated into its intelligence. And then there's these transformative experiences that open up new domains in which infinite truths can proceed. But all of that has to be conceived dynamically, so that we say, yes, there are processes, there are ancient or seemingly timeless processes, which I sort of think of as forms of the event that have already been captured in the process, right? That if you could zoom right in on what's happening in that one leaf or in that one quark, you'd get to a place where that it's completely novel, a completely new process is occurring in each of those moments, but that's already been accommodated by the system. It's part of our timeless affordance. But there's also the new affordances, the increasingly higher level disruptions by which novelty and some kind of new opening comes into the world. And I think you're right that the one that the philosophers have been anticipating for the last 150 years, or maybe through the whole modern period, has essentially already occurred. It was underway the whole time, though the inherent logic of electronic networks has been moving forward into digital systems and into the kind of complete reconfiguration. I mean, I think you said it very well, is a kind of like a meta technology. It's not just a new technology among the other ones. It's a technology that enfolds and interpenetrates all the existing technologies. And that has already occurred. It hasn't finished occurring, but we're living it already. So our job is to articulate that and get up to speed rather than to be in an anticipatory mode, hoping for a disruption. The disruption has occurred and we really haven't clearly noticed. We haven't taken it seriously enough. It's already here. We've already got sort of these machines. We're already super linked. We've already got bizarreness. It's been decades. It's been decades since a robot went on Jeopardy and defeated human beings in their game shows. The system has already changed, and we do have to take that very seriously. And that has a socio-historical technological component that we're discussing right now, but it also has its own timeless tantric radical consciousness component, which is, in my experience, or in our experience of every arising moment, the transfiguration has already occurred, and we have to learn to take that seriously and embody that.
Yeah, and the machine is really good at will to intelligence, but it's terrible at will to transcendence. Mm-hmm. It leaves creativity to us. It can't even crack a joke. And it can certainly not have sex with us, at least not yet. So, it's not pathos at all. It's just a strictly logos, intensely logos, and that's what it's good at. And that's what's going to change the world. But the whole pathical element is left to us. What Nietzsche was on fire about is completely left to us. The tantric is more important than ever in that sense. The sutric is what the machine will excel at, but the machine will never be tantric. It will never, ever be private. The machine will never, ever require sacred space. We might have to lock it up for our own good, but not for the machine's sake. So the sacred and the private here are still the human realms that have to be returned. We have to return to them aggressively in a new way and realize that that is what we have to save to take into the new world. And another way to look at this, to be honest about the event of digital, is to also realize a question one of my students asked the other week. He said, what would have happened if digital hadn't arrived? And I said, well, my guess is that we would have stopped breeding. The old institutions, the political institution, the academic institution, mass media would have been around, but would have been ossified. We would have seen ossification on a massive scale. We would have seen them degrade and grow old and boring and tired, but protective of their privileges, right? And that's exactly what they have done as well. But suddenly digital came along, and now we see the beginning of an event of a political that is post-political. So meaning that the role the political had, the way the monarchy had prior to it, will now be sensocratic. We now see that the academies are dying, but the willingness to learn and to accumulate knowledge and do something with it is greater than ever. So digital monasteries are being built. And we then see that monasteries led to academics. Academics is dying, but the will to knowledge is there. And the will to tell is certainly there, but it's just going to have whole new forms, and we get informationalism because of it. Anybody can today use Wikipedia better than they do, your average college professor to learn things. And the same thing, it comes with media, where advertising and all these things look more and more desperate and more out of tune and out of sync. And it's just like out of joint. It's like, do I really have to see another ad ever in my life again? I'm totally informed by my algorithms, by the way. I don't need ads, right? So why are ads still around? Because the old paradigm pretends it's still relevant. But instead of being ossified, the old institutions are now under threat. And that's why they look like they've come alive. But when you think about politics and academics and mass media and industry today, it's just by somebody's put a fire in their ass, right? That's what they looked, they're alive again, but really they were ossified. They were exhausted. They'd done their work. Postmodernism pointed out that they were finished. And I think we need to remember that if digital hadn't come along and in the way proposed to us, it was digital that made us discover climate change. And it was our dug into quantum physics that led eventually digital also gave us both atomic power and atomic bombs, right? So the technological evolution of the 20th century we now need to take a collective responsibility for. That is why we need religion again. So if that is to be done, then digital has fantastic potential. But then the event has already happened. Sorry, but you in Zizek, but you missed it. The train just drove by. We jumped on it. You guys can sit and wait for your guy with a penis. We took the machine. It's called Syntheos. It's already started.
I think there's two ways in which the shift, which has already occurred and is still occurring, requires us to make nihilism workable, right? One is that we have to embrace the release of the old patterns, right? We have to let them die. We have to be willing to grieve them. We have to recognize that a lot of our power structures and a lot of our institutions are hollow. They're running a program that doesn't apply anymore. There's all these ways where we look at the world and go, oh, look, it's like no one's doing their job at all. The institutions have just completely released their functions. So we have to accept that, appreciate that, let that die, help that die, let it become nothing. On the other hand, we also have to be looking about what are the practices that in the new form are going to allow us to mitigate toward our healthier version and away from our own self-destructive tendencies, right? There's whole new kinds of nihilism being produced by the internet. Like our ancestors never had to deal with a situation where they encountered so many cultural artifacts every day that they couldn't possibly treat any of them as meaningful. And so there's a sort of loss of meaning and a meaning crisis sense of, I just don't know what to believe anymore because I see so many potential beliefs. And my human brain did not evolve to handle 10,000 a day. It evolved to handle maybe 2 or 3 a day at most. So there's these whole new ranges of potential nihilism that we have to steer away from or understand better, but also this nihilism we have to embrace in terms of letting a whole bunch of systems just go and die, and really emotionally, viscerally letting that happen, not just knowing that they're out of date, but in ourselves letting them die.
Yeah, perfect example, conspiracy theories, right? So conspiracy theories thrive in a climate of powerlessness. So I feel I have no power over anything. And then you realize that you don't believe anybody has the power. Everything's run amok. Everything's out of control. So your mind starts imagining, but there must be a power there. It's just not making itself known. It's hidden to me. And all you need is a couple of guys around you somewhere in your subculture online who come up, have the same need, are looking for the same thing. And one of them comes up with this crazy idea that if you take a COVID-19 shot, Bill Gates is putting a chip in your arm. Well, in that case, Bill Gates would probably own the world's, tops industry and put all those nose tops in there to begin with, because he could have put a chip in your nose a year ago if he wanted that. But, forget about the logical arguments here. They're out the window, the first thing to go. So the need for a conspiracy so that somebody's in charge is, again, we cannot believe that God is dead. So some kind of God or some gods must be there, even if they're evil or whatever. Maybe it's even easier if they're evil, because then you can at least, yell at them or whatever, but they're there. And that's why conspiracy theories are thriving. And precisely like you pointed out, a problem that's potentially even bigger for humanity than climate change and atomic bombs is the problem of complexity. We're not born to handle this amount of complexity. We're not born to handle 100,000 people in our lives. We're born to handle 100, maybe 200 at most. Now we meet 100,000 people during a lifetime. And you got Tinder in your pocket, and with Tinder, you say yes or no, yes or no, yes or no to people who are smiling at you, and they're doing the same thing, and you end up just being married to Tinder because you're not civilized enough any longer to go on a date with one of those people that actually said yes to you, that you said yes to. That should be enough for you to go on a date with somebody, but you won't, because maybe it's the next phase you should look at, and it's just an addiction. And that sort of circular addictive behavior is now becoming so common that it's becoming the new normal. And this is why we in Digital Libido wrote darkly that this is a hugely nihilistic phase in history, because it is a breakdown of a paradigm. The new values of the new paradigm have not been established yet. And the few people who figured them out wonder if they should even share them. So what the old paradigm is trying to do is to keep itself alive, pretending it's still there, like it would still be meaningful. And what then happens is that people feel a total disconnect. No, the pathical element, the most truthful element, the most intelligent element of the human being, my sense of direction in the world is lost. And that's what we prophesied and said that we're going to see more mental breakdowns and more mental illness than ever before in history. And we're going to see a loss of orientation on a massive scale. And it's going to go very, very, very dangerous, because all it needs is for somebody just light one of those lynch mobs and put a little anaject with a uniform in there, and the Hitlers are back. So that's what awaits us for the next 50 years, unfortunately. That's why nihilism is an incredibly, incredibly important topic to address. And I'm a strong proponent of what I call temporal nihilism. I think nihilism should be discussed as a social phenomenon, as a condition of a society that predicts its demise and fall. But a new society could be born out of it if an event has occurred, which I think it has. I think there's hope for that. But this whole shift is going to take so much effort from so many people, both working with what you guys admirably do. For example, the Zen monk aspect of Bruce and Layman here is the techniques that are timeless. If you can learn those, then certainly you can orientate yourself in any environment. Then the techniques that are specifically paradigmatic. So what is specific for the times we live in now? It could be possibly the archetype that specializes on those things. For example, you could be a really brilliant digital developer or a digital artist or something like that. You can really contribute and have a really meaningful life. But the sooner you can jump on board onto that, the more other people you could save from the sort of morass the consummarian morass that awaits us with people who are lost, which the conspiracy theories right now, we must take them seriously, not the theories themselves, but the fact they're occurring.
It's interesting to bring up conspiracy theories. I think you're quite right. Now, there's obviously some smart conspiracy theorists and some real conspiracies, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a kind of regression to improvised mythic psychosis as a way of trying to make sense of a world that is starting to show up as more complex than we can handle. And that's the nihilism in a developmental sense, maybe similar to what you call temporal nihilism, which is there's a way that value can be constructed in this new environment. And if we don't figure out how to do that, then we'll fall for the appearance of value in a way that actually regresses us to a previous level of sophistication, right? If we think we can't handle the new thing, we'll back up toward an old thing that's already empty. It no longer suffices. So the people who propose the solution to meaninglessness is to go back to the old churches, right? But the reason they encountered the meaninglessness was because the old churches already were not successfully producing the excessive value anymore. So they're going to double down on something that doesn't work and just make the problem worse. That's very similar to the conspiracy regression. And I think we're going to see a lot of that all over for a while. At the same time as some people are really succeeding in making the new values. So there'll be the tendrils of heaven, but a lot of hell is coming.
Yeah, it's true. But we have to be honest here. If the ironic and the affirmative elements, when we move out of nihilism right now, are too tantric for most people, then they are too tantric for most people. That's just got to take time. Sometimes you just have to sit and wait, although the mess is happening, because trying to do something about it would only make it worse. So cynical nihilism is now leaving the boardrooms. It's now leaving head office of politics and moving into the masses. And the way the masses react to cynical nihilism is precisely by saying that if I don't have any values left, that's absolutely horrible. I can't live with that. But at least I can hope that somebody else has some values. Okay? So I hope that there is a conspiracy of some kind that controls the world, because then they at least get some pleasure out of running the world as they see fit. Whereas I'm just a slave to their conspiracy. But then you have transferred the value to somebody else. So value is still around somewhere, because the real horror of nihilism is not that you become nihilistic. The real horror is that the world has become nihilistic. But as long as somebody else out there believes, you can go on. It's like an old person become very cynical about life, and you become bitter. You were unfortunate in life. You were horrible, but you're still around. You maybe wish to be dead, but you happen to have grandchildren and they're happy. So all you try to do is to contain yourself, lock yourself up into a bottle, like if you're an evil spirit, so that your grandchildren will not know your bitterness. And that's the best thing you can do at that time, because then the grandchildren can at least know a world without resentment and be given the chance to be heroic before they encounter the sort of poison that you personify.
No, that's very, I think that's very much in line with a lot of things Zizek is pointing at, where that we experience it mediated through the other. And that's both in terms of, hey, it could work, right? If we see examples or hear that somebody can actually make value successfully in this new environment, then even if we can't, we know that's possible. But if our impression is that all the others no longer believe in anything, then we're in a bad situation.
You could even make it twice, which Zizek hasn't done. You could even say that Christian evangelicals in America voted for Donald Trump, knowing that it's not a Christian evangelical, still knew that he allowed them to believe in Christian evangelism for him. Right? And it works, right? Transference, right? Transference. Yeah, it's certainly tantric knowledge to understand how transference works. And I somehow hope that at least there's an evolution of conspiracy theories. It could go really bad, right? We don't have it. It's like with the COVID-19 virus. We don't know if it's going to go in even more nasty direction, or whether suddenly it's going to be a widespread nice version of it, which means it'll be over. Right? We don't know that about conspiracy theories either, because we don't know whether the sects and cults that are currently being created online will actually have to be even more hysterical and even weirder to attract attention from people who will then follow them, or whether there's a possibility of some kind of more moderate form of conspiracy theory, because hopefully it's more credible, because it's more modest or moderate, could actually be quite useful in that case. We don't know that yet. That's an interesting narratological landscape to be in, but we don't know
I think there's some very smart conspiracy theorists who can help us make better sense of our history, because our history is missing some of the things that happened. But there's another way in which I think complexity and conspiracy relate together, which is there are situations where something went on where the patterning involves so many incongruous elements that no one can grasp it properly. Right? I've just been reading Tom O'Neill's book about I don't want to say the real history of the Manson family, but he explains that basically everything we thought about it was false, even though he doesn't know what happens, because there was a role of Manson as an informant, and there were people from CIA programs there, and there were all these suspicious things. He doesn't know what the pattern is, but all these very suspicious things were happening in the same place in the same time and interacting. And that it's so complex that he can't solve it. He can't lock it down to a narrative explanation. And the conspiracy theorist would like to be able to say, well, that means this, and that explains everything. And that's their response to the fact that the reality is so complex we can't get our hands around it. And that feels to a lot of people like nothingness. If I can't lock it down in the narrative, it has no reality. And therefore, I'm confronting the fact that there is no reality. And because I'm worried about it, that means I kind of believe that maybe there's no reality unless I double down on an old narrative of some kind. So there's a real test involved there in some conspiracy theories of whether we can take the peculiarity and the ambiguity or not.
That's the real priest. That's the spirit of the priest. The priest is the guy who stands in front of you, who you have to return to eventually, because he's the guy, remember, like, he didn't say too much. He didn't draw too many conclusions. He actually stayed what he could say and stayed firmly with that. That requires distance.
Yeah. He's shamanically grounded in the face of the incongruity of reality.
Yeah. And I think that's the character we're looking for right now. We're looking for more Zizeks and more Badiou's. We're not looking for their hero, you know, the Messiah with the big penis walking through the door they're looking for. You know, that's not going to happen. No, we're looking for more Zizeks, more Badiou's, and I would say more socioanalysts, to use the term that Cattle Last and I love to use all the time. But I believe in the socioanalytical project as the main one. And obviously, Jan and I have tried to sort of build a platform from that. Slavoj Žižek has done the same thing. I think we need more of that. We need more of the sort of the priestly character who stays within what can be said and doesn't jump too far or draw too many conclusions, because people are way too willing to throw mythos at the logos before actually any mythos can be said. And therefore they destroy the logos. They try to destroy the logos.
And they're counterbalanced by another group of people who want to deny mythos and logos and incongruity altogether. So you get populations breaking up into people who want to double down on a simplistic mythic narrative that ignores reality, and another group of people who wants to say, no, it's already completely covered in the official narrative. There's no mystery here at all.
Yeah, I'm fighting with anti-waxers in Europe at the moment. I'm a big waxer myself, so I'm coming out as a waxer right now in case that is controversial. You know, I look at the numbers. 1 billion people have been vaccinated. They don't die. So, but I'm defending the right for people not to be vaccinated. You know, if they don't want to, fine. You know, but then don't ruin my life in that case. And I get attacked by anti-waxers for saying that too. So, he's like, well, wait a second. I just defended your right not to take the vaccination, requiring you in that case to take the full responsibility for not getting a vaccination, since it is available and it's for free. You can have it. But, you know, it's precisely when people start attacking you with completely contradictory arguments just because you used the wrong word and therefore you're the enemy. That's when, you know, they've gone completely wrong. And that's what we're seeing.
They're mediating themselves through the other, like what we were saying before. Like, you may be saying, hey, you have the right to do this, but the fact that you're doing something different means that the other is doing something different, which means they feel invalidated, which means their entire validation system is highly dubious and should probably be allowed to die.
Yeah. Saying that there are people who don't want to be vaccinated for very logical reasons, you know. I can understand that a few healthy 18-year-olds right now feel that even the Delta mutant doesn't motivate them enough. And that's a good logical argument. I don't mind that at all. But we're talking about the illogical here. We're talking about the whereas the priest stands with the logos and says what can be said. Firmly convinced about it, having thought it through properly.
Yeah, he shows you the edge of what's thinkable,
Yes.
Without allowing you to pretend you're thinking the unthinkable.
Yes. But then he gets the mob coming at him, and they're throwing rocks at him in the sense that they're throwing their mythologies at him, their myths at him that expand on what he just said. And they think they're going to be cherished by him because they wildly expand on what he said. And then the priest has to stay there and stay the course and say, no, you can't make that conclusion from what I just said. You're just guessing and fantasizing. And that has been the problem all along, which I, as a priest, stand against, right? That's the truly prophetic stance today. And I think we need more Zizeks and Badiou's instead of their big hero. That's my response. And I think that's the proper take on the process and the event.
We need more Desmonds also. You may not be very familiar, but William Desmond with his metaxology. And, you know, there's the univocal, people who are looking for the single truth that they can hold on to. And there's the equivocal, who are the pluralists and who want to have, you know, who want to equalize everything in multiple views. And then there's the dialectical, which sees how the many is enfolded back into a single dialectical realization. And then there's the metaxologist, who sees that there's always an excess to the dialectical enfoldment. And the metaxologist is the one who remains right there in the middle and at the edge, at that adjacency point. And I think we need priests and leaders and theorists like that.
Yeah, who can say exactly where in the Hegelian dialectic we are right now. I agree with that. Guys, we've done our 90 minutes, and I promised, you know, some of the followers of us that although how much they love us, they love more of us, but we should stay with the 90 minutes format. So, as always, a pleasure.
Yep, that's perfect. We'll save anything else for the next one. And if somebody sends me a plane ticket, maybe I'll see you in Germany soon.
Yeah. I'm going to the Merge in Berlin, and I'm hoping Bruce and Layman can make it there too. But if you Google Emerge and then Berlin and then October and 2021, you're likely to run into the Merge Festival in Berlin in October. And we hopefully see you all there.
Yeah, good to see both of you, and I'm looking forward to our next chat.
Yeah, yes, same here.
So do I. Yes. Big love to you both.
You too. Take care.